Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Political Pulse. It is I, the jovial, the gesturing Josef Goodman. And joining me today is the lovely Shannon Connors. Thank you so much for joining me, Shannon.
Thanks for having me, Joseph.
Yeah, you excited?
Yeah.
Now, this is your first time on radio, is it not?
It is my first time on the radio.
And you're a senior.
I am.
So you're welcome. I'm getting you onto radio right before you leave these grand old halls.
This will be the pinnacle.
This will be the pinnacle. So, Shannon, we have a lot to talk about today, and we have only 30 minutes. I know, only 30 minutes, but it goes by so quickly. A few, just laundry things, just logistics I have to get to. Number one, I want to thank my mother out there. I always do this before the beginning of the show. Usually I would thank my father as well, but he is a conference. Apparently I'm, not as important as business, doctoring, surgerying, or whatever it is he calls it nowadays. So, Mother, thank you so much. You are now probably the only one out there live listening to us. But not to worry, because later today we'll upload this to Facebook as well, but to YouTube. And last week, Sean, do you know, it went viral. It went wildfire, crazy, yeah?
I heard that. Everyone's talking.
Everyone is talking about this. Harry Graver came on the show last week. 142 hits. Boom. Wow, no? So and the week before that we had Will Jordan. Will Jordan. He was your successor, wasn't he?
He was quite a guy.
Because, ladies and gentlemen, lady, mommy out there, Shannon here was the chairman of the Independent Party of the Yale Political Union. And so we're really glad to have her. And she's a libertarian, so she says. Maybe, if I can work my magic here, if my eloquence pays off, if my persuasion, if my force of words, perhaps we can convert her to the good old side. I'm not really sure what that is quite yet. So, Shannon, you ready?
Yeah.
Let's start this up. But, actually, before I do, I forgot to do this at the beginning. I was supposed to applaud myself in. So can we do that again? Would that be okay?
I think it's necessary.
I think it's necessary as well. So very quickly, we're going to applaud myself in. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the one and only Josef Goodman. Yes, they're really sweet. I have to pay these guys to come in here and do it.
You have adoring fans.
I do, and I want to thank them once again for that. So Shannon, let's talk.
All right.
You are a libertarian? What does that even mean?
Yeah, so I think that some of the most important things for us to consider when we're thinking about government and when we're thinking about sort of politics in general is maintaining as much personal liberty as possible, keeping things as decentralized as possible so that really our governments are able to respond to the needs of the people they're serving. And I think that's really hard on sort of a national, massive scale. And so what I'm really most concerned about is keeping things small, keeping as many individual rights protected as possible, and making sure that the government doesn't interfere that much. I think most of the time things are done better when they're done by organizations or groups that aren't necessarily sort of the massive bureaucratic federal government.
Well, I like that. And in fact, people are already commenting over the web. They're saying, bring back a West Wing clip. Now, last week I had a West Wing clip, a great one.
It's good television. Aaron
Sorkin, he's the man. And so people are asking for a West Wing clip, and I have one perfectly for what you just talked about small government. So, before we go on with this lovely, and I'm having a great time. Are you having a good time?
I'm having a great time.
I think this is going fantastically. I really do. And I have my chin on my arm right now. This is amazing. This is everything I've always wanted. So before we get back to you, Shannon, we're going to cut to the West Wing clip, and it's relevant. So you ready for this?
Yeah.
Let's hear Aaron Sorkin himself.
Toss. Governor Ritchie, the first question is for you. Governor Ritchie, good evening.
Good evening.
Perhaps the biggest philosophical difference between you and the president is over the role of the federal government itself and whether national problems really have national solutions. Can you explain your view?
Well, first, let me say good evening and thank you. It's a privilege to be here. My view of this is simple. We don't need a federal Department of Education telling us our children have to learn Esperanto, they have to learn Eskimo poetry.
Eskimo poetry.
Let the states decide. Let the communities decide on health care, on education, on lower taxes, not higher taxes. Now, he's going to throw a big word at you, unfunded mandate. He's going to say if Washington lets the states do it, it's an unfunded mandate. But what he doesn't like is the federal government losing power. But I call it the ingenuity of the American people.
President Bartlett, you have 60 seconds for a question and an answer.
Well, first of all, let's clear up a couple of things. Unfunded mandate is two words, not one big word. There are times when we're 50 states and there are times when we're one country and have national needs. And the way I know this is that Florida didn't fight Germany in World War II or establish civil rights. You think states should do the governing wall to wall. That's a perfectly valid opinion. But your state of Florida got $12.6 billion in federal money last year from Nebraskans and Virginians and New Yorkers and Alaskans with their Eskimo poetry. 12.6 out of a state budget of $50 billion. I'm supposed to be using this time for a question, so here it is. Can we have it back, please? Game on! Oh my God.
What did you think? That was pretty spectacular.
That was a good comeback
Right?
from the president.
Yeah, Mr. President Jed Bartlett here. So I'm going to be Jed Bartlett for this evening.
I like it.
For the next 25 minutes. So you talk about small government, okay? But these are slogans. These are, the things that you go around on the campaign trail and say, small government, low taxes. I need specifics. I want meat. What are certain things that the government should not be doing?
Sure.
The federal government.
I mean, I think it's easier to say what the federal government should be doing, right? Because for me, at least, there aren't that many things. I think national defense is something, he brings up a great point in the clip. The United States fought World War II. And that's really important, that we have a unified defense structure. Maybe not as big as it is right now, but that's something that I think we can all agree on and that we wouldn't be able to do effectively on our own. Certain aspects of highways, I think, are sort of related to defense and have a very important and central place in what our federal government is doing. Beyond that, I think things get a little hazy, except for the justice system, of course. We obviously need a Supreme Court. We need federal courts as well to know what the Constitution is saying and to see how that affects all of us. So those are things where I think being unified really is important. But things like education or healthcare or marriage, I think these are things that are much better left to communities or state level that have a better understanding of what people want and what people need, and they can also allocate the money more effectively. That's one of my problems with things like the Department of Education. There's a lot of waste there, and there's a lot of not being able to experiment because you have these big commands coming from on high, and I feel like that leads to less innovation in certain areas.
I like that. But let me ask you this. What was I going to ask you? I've just forgotten. You blew me away. Case over? Ladies and gentlemen, we're ending early. It's only 5:37, but, she came in there, she hit a home run. But, okay, so I'm beginning to get a sense of what this libertarian paradise looks like. Can you bring me back to a time in U.S. history in which we were this libertarian paradise? Was it the 1890s, the 1920s?
So, I really do. I wish I could. But I think that especially early on in the U.S. government, there were always a couple of things that really ruined this for us. I don't think we've ever been
like
there.
Jim Crow, women not even allowed to vote, those kind of things.
Exactly. I mean, even before that, if you look at the sort of early U.S. government, you have two main problems. You have slavery, and you have all these protective tariffs. And those do two really important things, or not important, bad things, in limiting liberty. With slavery, obviously, a huge violation of personal liberty, atrocious, something that we needed to get rid of. And with these protective tariffs, yes, you're benefiting some of the producers or the merchants at home, but you're really limiting people's ability to buy the things at sort of competitive prices. You're privileging some people over other people. So I don't know if we've ever really been there. It's something that we're probably striving towards in certain ways, but there have always been a lot of problems.
Okay, but so let's go back to 2008. Barack Obama, he's elected. A recession's on his hands, the worst since the Great Depression. How does a libertarian act? Millions of people have just lost their jobs. Isn't it time now for strong, centralized government?
I don't really think so. I think now is the time to allow, one, not to put on sort of any additional burdens, regulatory burdens, things that are going to cause people to need to pay more taxes. I also think that this is a time, especially when states really need to respond to the crises that are happening there. The recession...
But the states can't really do that so effectively if they have to balance their budget, if that means they have to cut things, fire teachers.
I think that cutting things... my mother is a teacher or was working in a school district. She's somebody who unfortunately was cut as a result of budget deficits. And it was really hard for me to sort of balance...
Your mother was fired?
She was laid off.
She was laid off? I'm
yeah.
sorry. I shouldn't say fired.
No, don't worry.
Bit harsh that she was laid off because of budget cuts.
She was.
And so then how can you possibly reconcile what happened to your mother with wait, maybe the federal government should have stepped in and done something about this.
So it was a really hard experience for me to think about, but I think in those instances, despite the fact that there is this really awful temporary sort of loss and pain in a family or in a community, that gets magnified when we just pound people with more and more taxes, and then they have so much coming down on them, or the federal government is just borrowing more money that's going to be taxes that we have to pay later on. That provides a lot of long-term problems.
Okay, but the federal government the federal government actually cut taxes. Back in 2009 with the Obama stimulus package, $400 billion it took tax cuts. So this wasn't adding more burden to people, this is actually less burden for them.
So we cut taxes for some people, right? And that's part of our problem here, that we think that just shifting tax burdens is something that is always going to make everything better. And I'm not really sure it does. I think that makes people really concerned about their money and less likely to invest or, take other risks in the market that might benefit people and help other industries get people back on their feet in different ways. I'm very skeptical of our nation thinking that the only way to get us back on our feet is through the federal government. I'm not sure that that's as sustainable, and I'm not sure that that really breeds a relationship between people sort of who have a lot of this money and want to put it out into the world and the people who are being helped. It makes it very impersonal.
But what I'm concerned about is that it sounds heartless. It doesn't sound sensitive. Your mother was laid off. Millions of other people were laid off. And so it's one thing to say, you know what? Things in life happen this way. What are you going to do about it? But, millions of people have now lost their jobs. And I just feel that there's just isn't that compassion that needs to be there. And I think that at a time when no one else can do this, the federal government must step in. I think when nobody else can prevent a teacher from being laid off, when nobody else can prevent, a factory worker, that's a bit more complicated because factory workers obviously are not public employees. But I just feel that the federal government has an obligation when nobody else can to step in and say, wait a second, we're going to lend money to the states so that they can make sure that these teachers don't get fired. I don't think that's something so, inconceivable to... Would you agree?
So, I see your point when you talk about compassion, but I think that there are two different ways to look at this. The first is, yes, we can have the government come in and save these jobs and sort of have that kind of compassion. But then there are sort of other kinds of compassion too. The first is, I think, thinking long term and thinking about the burden that's going to be placed on our children and our grandchildren. That's a type of long-term compassion. And I also think, it's hard for me really to conceptualize. But
I would also argue, I'm sorry to cut you off here.
Go ahead.
But if you want to talk about the long term, when someone's mother's just being let off from from work, that is some serious systemic problems that you're just bringing into the household. A family can't recover from that.
Sure. That's definitely true. But I think a lot of these jobs, perhaps with teachers it's a bit more complicated, but with a lot of other government
Let's
workers...
talk about GM. Let's say a GM, okay? Would you have told Obama, what would you have told Obama? GM is about to collapse, a company that employs hundreds of thousands of people. One of the largest, if not the largest car producer in the world. What would you have told Obama? Would you have told him to pull the plug on GM? Or would you have told him, you know what? Millions of people have their livelihoods based, on this. What are we going to do?
So, again, you're probably going to say I'm not being compassionate enough. But
I'm not. I am going to say that.
I do think that... So the problem here is that we're allowing these industries that aren't innovating. We're allowing industries that are sort of stagnating. Yes, they employ lots of people, but they're not going to be able to compete long term. And
we don't know that. GM is doing pretty well for itself nowadays. It's now the largest car producer in the world once again.
Sure.
So For now, okay, but you give something a second chance. Perhaps it can redeem itself. Perhaps it can cut things.
But there's no incentive initially to really do that kind of thinking about new ways of solving problems. We see this with energy all the time. We give subsidies to things. We rely so much on
I think on that we can both agree that why are we giving all this big cash to the big oil companies?
To the big oil companies, to the farmers. There are lots of instances where...
The poor farmer? Farmer Will?
The farmer chairman.
Farmer chairman. We're talking once again, ladies and gentlemen, about Will Jordan, who was a guest here a few weeks ago. But continue, Shannon, you're talking.
So there are these instances where we provide support. We come in. Yes, we're able to solve problems temporarily. Yes, we're able to stave off people being fired in the short term. But we're not actually moving our country in a direction where we can have more sustainable long-term employment. Just bulking up our federal government or government employees or people who are in some way employed by the states. That's not actually sort of creating a lot of value in many instances. Certainly we need some people to hold these jobs, but that shouldn't be the majority.
For sure, but I feel that, when it came to GM, the government gave GM money. The federal government, it became General Motors, then it became, funny, government motors. It gave GM money on certain conditions. It didn't give them a blank check like it did, for example, with the big financials, with AIG, with the Goldmans of the world. But it said, GM, listen, you want this money? Okay. But there are these certain conditions. And now you took it, for example, the GM Volt. The GM Volt, which is now an electric car that can run 50 miles without you having to buy gas. Sometimes 100 miles. Maybe I'm making that. No, I think 100 miles. And that is the government basically saying, listen, GM, we're going to give you money, but you must innovate. So this is the federal government and the private sector coming together in a partnership that works.
So I'll give you that.
Yes, 1 point. Woohoo!
Point
Ladies and gentlemen, we're already going on spring break now.
But I sort of have two counters to that.
Uh-oh. I'm going to cut you off. Mic off. Ladies and gentlemen, you're alone with me now.
So the first point, I think the car industry is really, car and oil and sort of the connection between that and our federal government has been messed up for a very long time.
True.
There are innovations that European car manufacturers have made, decades before anything was thought of in the U.S. because of this very cozy relationship between the federal government and these other sectors. So that's a problem. The second is, while the federal government is able to come in and do these things, I would much rather the same kind of boost and the same terms and conditions be done through very wealthy people. There are very wealthy people out there who don't need to take on the debt responsible for everyone. It's not everybody's responsibility to save GM. I think that it's probably a great investment for somebody. And they should be able to put restrictions on that.
Yeah, but no one was willing. No one was willing. When people aren't willing, then the federal government has to do it.
Maybe people weren't willing because GM wasn't putting forth a good proposal. You get a lot more pressure to think about things.
But even when you say, the private sector can do things, the private sector, for example, a PE firm called Cerberus Capital, went in, bought out Chrysler, took it out of a public company, made it into a private company, and Chrysler had to go back a few years later and ask the federal government for more money. So yes, you can talk about the private sector and how they should be doing things, but time and time again, and we see this as just one example with Cerberus, they just don't do it.
I think that's oversimplifying things a little bit. You have a bad example.
Are you saying I'm reductive?
No, I think you're using a good tactic.
Oh, snap.
It's that West Wing clip. You got me in a sassy mood. But I think, sometimes the private sector isn't able to do things perfectly. That happens with the government all the time.
Sure.
More often, I would say. You would disagree.
I don't know. I think...
But I also think, the fewer restrictions that we have, the fewer regulations we have, the more effective these private sector interventions could be. I think it's very hard with a lot of government oversight, with a lot of regulation, with a lot of these standards that we need to conform to that aren't necessarily helping. It's hard to really come in and innovate. Maybe one of the reasons why the GM government partnership worked so well is because the government was also, setting the terms of what they had to come up to in that. You see? I
see what you're saying. I still think, though, that's a pretty condemning to say that, it's a pretty condemning fact that Cerberus Capital, a PE, couldn't pull off the job and that it required the government to come on in. But I want to move ahead because, we still have a bit more time. But you talked about a bit about regulation and how you want to see less. Now, I would argue that one of the reasons why we had this financial crisis in the first place was due to less regulation, to the fact that these big banks, the Goldmans, the Lehmans, the hedge funds of the world, they were underregulated, and that the fact that they need to be regulated is the reason why millions of people are now unemployed.
No, I wouldn't say that.
So it has nothing to do with underregulation.
I think that it has to do with bad regulation and with sort of a very uncomfortable partnership. The financial...
You keep talking about these partnerships, yeah.
But I think the financial crisis is also something that was very tied up in this housing market fiasco,
right, really. Which the government also drank the Kool-Aid.
Right. Everybody drank the Kool-Aid there, and we we really had people being convinced, both by the federal government and by the private sector, that they should be taking out these loans, that they should be getting these houses that they clearly weren't equipped to pay for. So I think that is a very messy situation. I think that we need better regulation. I think that the SEC...
Also simplified, I was also saying. Because,
Exactly.
take a look at this Frank Dodd bill, and this is something, again, we can agree on. I'm going to take points for all of the points that we can agree on.
Oh, yeah.
The Frank Dodd is, what, over 1,000 pages?
The Frank Dodd,
I don't even know what it talks about half the time. Give me...
it makes things more complex.
I'm laughing about something. Jon Stewart had this great bit.
Funny guy.
Funny guy, right? I try to be the Jon Stewart of radio, ladies and gentlemen. What do you think? You think I'm pulling it off? But no, Jon Stewart had this great bit in which, he cut to Herman Cain. He was like, I want these financial regulation bills to only be 3 pages long. And then Jon Stewart comes out and says, I am Herman Cain, and I do not lack reading. I thought that was quite funny. But go back to what you're saying.
So I think having these really massive, long bills, these huge regulations, it sort of gives everyone bad incentives. It gives the private companies more incentives to sort of cheat and get around the system because they have so many arcane rules that they need to get around. And then there are only a few people who really understand it. So you're concentrating the power of who's regulating, of knowing what's going on, to a really small group of people. I'd be fine with some small, simplified regulations. I think companies should have, especially these big financial instruments, definitely should be having people check in on them sometimes. We should be having these open markets that people are able to see and look into and be checked on. But burdening it with tons and tons of regulations
Right, for sure. Right.
is something that I think we often hope is going to fix the problem, but just makes the system so much more complicated that we can't even tell when people are gaming it then.
And we see this now, in fact, because if you take a look at the number of IPOs, for example, that are coming to Wall Street versus going to places like London, like Hong Kong, people are actually saying, wait a second, look at we're having fewer IPOs coming to Wall Street every year versus people going to Hong Kong and just because of the regulation. So I think that's something that we can agree on, that we just need smarter, more simplified regulation. Although I think we do need a bar. We do need a baseline somewhere. And I just don't think that we had reached that bar when it came, for many, many years up until the financial crisis. I think now we've set the bar. It has to be higher than what it was in 2004, 2005. But we need to be able to see the bar. It's really murky behind all this mist and etc. Now I want to talk a bit about... Actually, I told you I was going to ask you this earlier in the show. Or actually, before we came on, I said, Shannon, I'm going to ask you, who's your favorite president? And maybe now this is a good time. I do want to talk a bit about the healthcare bill that Obama passed a few years ago. But before we get to that, just to throw it out there to all your friends out there, who is your favorite president?
Calvin Coolidge.
No, you're joking.
I'm not.
Can I tell you something? Do you know who... I brought Harry Graver onto the show last week.
He's a Coolidge man, too.
And he's a Coolidge man, too. People are going to gain suspicious whether I'm being paid by, some Calvin Coolidge super PAC or something. Really, Calvin Coolidge? What? Are you going to give me the Harry Graver answer as well? Why is he your favorite president?
So I have 2 reasons. One's probably going to be a little unexpected for you. But the first, obviously, Coolidge, he really shrank the size of government.
This is so funny. I'm sorry. you had no idea that this is also what Harry Graver said, did you?
No.
Oh my God. Who would have thought? I was shocked then. I'm shocked now. Continue.
Yeah, no. Coolidge reduced the size of government. He really got the government out of a lot of areas. But something else that I really like about Coolidge as a president, and something that I think isn't brought up as much, is that he really spoke out about civil rights for African Americans and Catholics during his presidency. He didn't appoint anyone from the KKK to his cabinet. That was a huge deal at the time.
Yeah.
And
Woodrow Wilson, for example, we all think of him as self-determination, democracies of the world uniting under some Kantian utopia. Except he didn't allow for self-determination of African Americans back home.
Exactly. And so I think besides, having a lot of this rosy deregulation that I like, I think Coolidge was also someone who really valued the individual rights of everybody in his country. He didn't act on them as much as I think he should have. It was sort of before that time, unfortunately, but he was considering this, especially in the people he brought into his government. And I think that's a great thing for a president to think about.
I'm sorry, I'm still laughing that back-to-back weeks we've had Calvin Coolidge come out ahead of the 43 other presidents as number one.
He's having a renaissance.
He's having a renaissance, and you are his Michelangelo. Obamacare. Do you hear that? People are people protesting outside against Calvin Coolidge being number one.
So
but
have we
Obamacare, because you talked about how, at the beginning when you first explained your political philosophy, that certain things should be left up to the states. One of those things should be healthcare.
Absolutely.
You want to talk a bit more about how this about that?
Sure. So,
And then I'm going to have to cut in eventually, because I know liberals are going to talk to me and say, Joseph, you let her speak for too much. She just sounded so good out there, and she's spreading these bad things. So talk, and maybe I'm going to cut you off and maybe have a few points of my own to counter with.
oh, go right ahead. So I think, let's take Massachusetts, for example. I think that it's very similar to the sort of Obamacare that we have right now. And I think that's something that for a state level,
97% of all people in Massachusetts are covered.
By all means, go right ahead on the state level.
Counterpoint.
But I'm very, very uncomfortable with the idea of the federal government saying that you have to buy something. With a lot of other instances, like auto insurance, for example. You don't want to drive a car? You don't need it. Your state tells you want to drive a car? You need auto insurance. But to say that simply by virtue of living somewhere, the federal government is going to force you to buy something is something that I'm very uncomfortable with.
Why?
So I don't think that it's the business of the federal government to say what we do and do not.
But the
need to
business of
buy.
the government should be to protect people, and I think that's what it's doing.
I think the business of the government should be to protect people from foreign invasions, to protect people.
But not to protect them from themselves?
No,
or even to
absolutely
protect their
not.
family members?
No.
So, for example, let's say I don't have health care insurance. Something happens to me, and my my family now has to remortgage our house to pay for my operation. So not only have I pulled myself into this mess, but I've pulled my wife. I don't have a wife out there.
One day.
One day, hopefully, fingers crossed. But now I pulled my wife. I pulled my kids into this whole mess, and so a lot more people than just myself are now affected by the fact that I have to get hip surgery.
Certainly. So I think kids are separate. I think that kids really should be covered. And if if that was going to be taken to a federal level, I'd be far less uncomfortable with that, because I really do think that minors are people who don't have that kind of effect and shouldn't be held responsible for the actions of their parents. That's something that I feel really strongly about. But
But even when an adult gets an operation, his kids are affected, not physically. I mean, they're not the ones that obviously are hurt. But I have to pay with my own cash to pay for this surgery, and that comes out of what I can provide for them.
Certainly. I think that this is something that could or should be provided by charitable organizations.
But they're not going to do the job.
That's not true at all. They don't. One of the reasons why we don't have as many charities doing things right now.
Do you think so?
I think it has to do with the tax burden that people are under and the fact that they now expect the federal government to do things.
But, then we go back to the Herbert Hoover argument, in which Herbert Hoover, the Great Depression, he expected the private charities to come in and do the job of the federal government. 1933, you have almost 40% unemployment out of the agricultural sector. And the private charities weren't providing people with jobs. The private charities just cannot take on the job of providing hundreds of millions of people. I just don't see that as feasible.
So I don't think that the private sector is the charities are going to provide people with jobs, but I think the people who actually are unable to provide some kind of baseline of, say, health insurance for themselves.
I just don't see. I'm sorry to cut you off again. You want to speak?
No, you cut me right off.
My radio show, my rules. When in Rome, I'm joking. But I just, I'll give you a great example. I was reading an article in the New York Times the other week. I know perhaps you just don't flip through the New York Times. You're more of a Wall Street Journal gal, perhaps.
I read the style section of the Times. I get the rest of my news in the Journal.
And it was all about, talking to these Tea Party folks. And these Tea Party folks saying, get the government out of my life. Get the government out of my life. But wait a second. Medicare had just paid for your your mother to get hip surgery twice. Millions of dollars just then. Twice. Okay? I just don't see private charities being able to do that for millions of people. I mean, you have people, you have 100,000 not centurions, those are the Roman legionary folks, centenarians, is that the word? People over 100?
Yeah,
you have 100,000 over 100-year-olds. I just don't see private charities being able to organize themselves, and having the kind of capital, no matter what kind of incentives you make it for people out there to donate to. I just don't see themselves being able to manage the task of providing hip surgeries, of providing vaccines for the hundreds of millions of people out there.
They don't need to provide all of it. I mean, something that is a really good option here is things like health savings accounts, which, are being eliminated as a result of the Obamacare. And that allows people to sort of save up to consider these really massive health problems that they might incur, to put that in the minds of members of their family, but not to say, here's a standard that you need to match in terms of how you're covering yourself, what you're covering yourself for. And I think that kind of long-term planning, thinking about those things in a much more concrete way, as opposed to just assuming that they're going to be taken care of, that's part of the problem too. We no longer encourage people to think long-term and to actually plan for these things because they just assume that eventually the government's going to take care of it.
All right, with that, I have one last thing to end off with. The 99% or the 1%, Shannon? That's I was throwing you a bit of a tricky question because...
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know where...
A false dichotomy, perhaps?
False dichotomy.
False dichotomy, perhaps. Well, listen, ladies and gentlemen, we have to go, but thank you so much for joining us on The Political Pulse. Shannon, you want to wave goodbye to my mother?
Goodbye, Mrs. Goodman. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah. Everybody, thanks once again. I'm actually not going to be here next week because spring break has been broken. It will have broken by then, but I will be returning late March, so we have a lot of more interviews to go. Ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful February 27th. Have a great day.